A rifle does not care how old the hands are. It only remembers who truly understands the wind. The words drifted quietly across the long-distance firing range, but almost no one paid attention. Under the bright California afternoon sun at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, dozens of United States Marines moved with disciplined precision between spotting scopes, ballistic computers, wind meters, and carefully prepared firing positions. Every piece of equipment represented the latest generation of long-range marksmanship. Every shooter believed technology had finally pushed the limits of human accuracy farther than ever before. At the far end of the range, nearly 4,000 meters away, a steel target shimmered through waves of rising heat. It had become the most talked-about challenge of the entire training event. Throughout the week, experienced Marine marksmen had attempted the shot using custom-built rifles, advanced optics, and detailed environmental calculations. Some came close. None had succeeded. Instructors quietly admitted that today's weather created constantly shifting conditions. Wind crossed the valley from multiple directions before disappearing behind uneven ridgelines, while pockets of hot air distorted the image beyond what even expensive optics could fully correct. The computers continued producing firing solutions, yet every solution seemed slightly different from the one before. Staff Sergeant Ryan Carter folded his arms as another Marine completed a careful attempt. Several long seconds passed before the distant spotter shook his head. Another miss. A few frustrated laughs spread across the firing line. Someone blamed the changing wind. Someone else blamed the software. Nobody blamed themselves. Standing several yards behind the line, unnoticed by almost everyone, an elderly man watched the entire scene without speaking. Nathan Walker was 81 years old. His gray hair moved gently beneath the afternoon breeze. A faded field jacket rested comfortably over a simple plaid shirt, and an old leather rifle case hung from one shoulder beside a worn canvas range bag that looked older than many of the Marines themselves. His weathered eyes never followed the rifles. Instead, they remained fixed on the distant hills, the movement of dry grass, the shadows stretching across the valley, and the tiny range flags fluttering at different angles hundreds of yards apart. He seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. A young Marine noticed him first. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks exchanged an amused glance with another shooter before quietly saying, "Looks like somebody wandered into the wrong century." Several nearby Marines chuckled. One nodded toward Nathan's old equipment. "That rifle case probably belongs in a museum." The laughter spread naturally through the firing line. Nathan simply smiled without offense. He continued watching the valley as though their comments had disappeared into the wind. Staff Sergeant Carter finally approached him with polite professionalism. "Sir, this area is restricted to participants." Nathan nodded respectfully. "I understand." His calm voice carried no irritation. "I only wanted to watch." Carter glanced at the faded leather case. "Were you a shooter once?" Nathan answered with quiet honesty. "A very long time ago." Before Carter could respond, another unsuccessful shot echoed across the range. The spotter announced another clean miss. Nathan slowly looked toward the distant target before speaking almost to himself. "The rifle is not the problem." Several Marines turned immediately. One of them laughed openly. "Really? Then what is?" Nathan shifted his attention back toward the valley rather than toward the young Marine asking the question. "Everyone here is measuring the wind," he said softly. "Nobody is watching what the ground is doing." For a brief moment, the firing line became strangely quiet. Then the laughter returned even louder than before. One Marine shook his head with a grin. If reading dirt could hit 4,000 meters, every old hunter in America would be teaching sniper school. Nathan never answered. He simply watched another wave of heat ripple across the valley floor as the distant steel target shimmered almost out of sight, and deep within his calm expression rested the unmistakable certainty of a man who had seen this exact illusion before. Nathan Walker remained exactly where he was, his attention fixed on the distant ridgeline, while another Marine settled behind the precision rifle. The instructors adjusted spotting scopes, entered fresh atmospheric data into ballistic computers, and compared wind readings from multiple electronic sensors positioned across the range. Every screen displayed slightly different numbers. Tiny changes in temperature, humidity, and air pressure forced constant recalculations. Staff Sergeant Ryan Carter watched the process with confidence. This was how modern long-range marksmanship worked. Every variable could be measured, every adjustment could be calculated, and every solution could be refined through technology. Nathan quietly observed the team without interrupting. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks glanced toward the elderly veteran again before shaking his head with an amused smile. "Sir, I appreciate your confidence," he said. "But these computers process more information in 1 second than anyone could calculate by hand." Several nearby Marines nodded in agreement. One of them lifted a compact weather meter into the breeze and grinned. "This little device knows more about the wind than any old story ever could." Nathan looked toward the instrument before returning his eyes to the valley below. "It measures the wind where you are standing," he answered calmly. "It cannot measure what the wind becomes after it leaves you." The Marine laughed politely. "That is why we have multiple stations." Nathan gave a slow nod. "And every station is telling you something different." Nobody answered immediately because the observation was true. One instructor looked down at his tablet again and frowned as another update appeared on the display. The firing solution had changed once more. Staff Sergeant Carter folded his arms. "Conditions are unstable today. That happens." Nathan smiled gently. "Conditions are always changing. The question is whether you are watching the numbers or watching the land." Ethan looked across the valley with growing curiosity. Heat shimmer floated above the dry ground like transparent waves. Dust drifted along one hillside while the range. Flags farther away pointed in slightly different directions. The landscape looked peaceful, yet every small movement seemed disconnected from the electronic predictions appearing on the screens. Another Marine completed his firing sequence. The rifle echoed across the valley before silence returned. Everyone focused on the distant steel target. 5 long seconds passed. The spotter lowered his binoculars and slowly shook his head again. "Mississippi slightly right." Frustration spread across the firing line. One shooter blamed the thermal distortion. Another questioned the ballistic software. A third insisted the target distance should be verified again. Nathan listened quietly until someone finally turned toward him with a smirk. "Well, old-timer, if all these computers are wrong, what would you do differently?" Nathan did not answer immediately. He crouched near the edge of the firing line and picked up a handful of dry soil. The grain slipped slowly through his fingers before the breeze carried the lightest particles away. He watched them drift only a few feet before disappearing into invisible currents. Then he stood and pointed toward the distant slope where scattered patches of dark rock interrupted the sunlit hillside. "See those shadows?" he asked softly. Almost nobody noticed them. Ethan narrowed his eyes until he finally understood what Nathan meant. The shadows were slowly stretching as the afternoon sun shifted, creating uneven bands of warm and cooler air across the valley floor. Nathan spoke almost as though he were remembering an old friend instead of explaining a lesson. "The computers believe the air is one thing. The Earth has already changed it into something else." Carter looked across the valley again, this time with less certainty than before. For the first time all afternoon, nobody laughed. The electronic displays continued updating every few seconds, but Ethan found himself looking away from the screens and studying the hills exactly as the elderly veteran had been doing since the moment he arrived. Nathan Walker slowly walked closer to the firing position without crossing the marked safety line. His eyes never drifted toward the expensive optics or glowing computer screens scattered across the benches. Instead, they followed the uneven ridges beyond the target, the pale patches of dry grass swaying at different rhythms, and the shimmering curtain of warm air rising from the valley floor. The Marines continued adjusting elevation turrets and updating ballistic software, while instructors compared fresh environmental readings. Every few minutes another solution appeared. Every few minutes another shooter prepared to prove that modern calculations would eventually solve the impossible shot. Yet every attempt ended the same way. A distant echo rolled across the hills, followed several seconds later by another quiet report from the spotter. "Mississippi," Nathan finally spoke, almost as though he were continuing a conversation that had started decades earlier. "You are all trying to predict the air. The air has already decided not to cooperate." One Marine smiled politely. "With respect, sir, the software updates every variable in real time." Nathan nodded. "Only the variables it knows how to measure." Staff Sergeant Ryan Carter folded his arms once more. "Then tell me what the computer is missing." Nathan looked toward a rocky hillside, nearly halfway to the target. The valley is breathing. Several Marines exchanged confused looks before laughter quietly spread again. Ethan Brooks did not laugh this time. He continued watching Nathan's eyes instead of his words. The old veteran seemed less interested in explaining himself than in reading a language written across the landscape itself. Nathan pointed toward a line of scattered brush illuminated by the afternoon sun. Look at the shadows beneath those bushes. Nobody moved. Ethan narrowed his eyes until he finally noticed something unusual. The shadows were slowly changing shape as invisible waves of warm air drifted uphill. The nearby range flags suggested one direction, yet loose dust farther away drifted another. The electronic instruments measured local conditions perfectly, but the terrain between the firing line and the steel target behaved like several different worlds connected together. Nathan slowly drew a shallow line across the dirt with the tip of his boot. A bullet does not fly through one atmosphere, he said quietly. It flies through many. The words settled over the group more heavily than anyone expected. One instructor instinctively looked back at the ballistic display before glancing toward the valley again. For the first time, the landscape appeared more complicated than the numbers on the screen. Another Marine prepared for yet another attempt. Nathan watched him settle behind the rifle before softly saying, "He will miss left this time." Ethan looked surprised. The firing solution on the computer predicted a slight correction to the right. Staff Sergeant Carter noticed Nathan's remark, but said nothing. The rifle fired. Everyone held their breath while the distant target shimmered behind waves of heat. Seconds later, the spotter lowered his binoculars. Impact left of the plate. Complete silence replaced the laughter. Carter immediately checked the recorded firing data. According to every instrument, the correction should have moved the shot closer to center. Instead, the miss had shifted exactly where Nathan predicted. Ethan slowly turned toward the elderly veteran. "How did you know?" Nathan smiled gently, without looking away from the valley. "Because the mountain told me before the computer could." Ethan followed Nathan's gaze once again. He no longer saw an empty stretch of hills. He saw sunlight striking rock, warm air climbing uneven slopes, dry grass bending at different speeds, and shadows quietly changing shape. None of the electronic displays described those movements, yet somehow the old veteran had been reading them since the moment he stepped onto the range. Deep inside Ethan's growing curiosity, one quiet thought refused to disappear. Perhaps the oldest man on the firing line was also the only one who truly understood what the valley had been saying all afternoon. The silence after Nathan Walker predicted the last miss lingered longer than anyone expected. Even the steady clicking of keyboards and the soft beeping of ballistic computers seemed strangely distant beneath the low whisper of the afternoon wind. Staff Sergeant Ryan Carter looked from the firing data back to the valley, searching for an explanation that fit the numbers in front of him. None of them did. The software remained accurate according to every measurable standard, yet reality continued refusing to follow its calculations. A young Marine finally broke the silence with a confident grin. "Maybe you should show us how it is done, sir." A few quiet laughs followed, though they sounded less certain than before. Nathan turned toward the speaker with the same calm expression he had carried all afternoon. "I did not come here to prove anything." The Marine shrugged. "Convenient answer." Another added, "You keep telling us what we are missing. If you really know the valley that well, take the shot." Ethan Brooks immediately glanced toward Nathan, wondering how he would respond. The old veteran looked back across the shimmering landscape before answering. "A difficult shot is never about pride." His voice remained steady. "It is about patience." The words only encouraged more skeptical smiles. One Marine stepped away from the firing line and folded his arms. 4,000 meters. One round. You have been reading the hills all afternoon. Show us what all that experience can do. Staff Sergeant Carter raised a hand, trying to keep the atmosphere professional. "This is still an official training exercise." Nathan nodded respectfully. "Then let your Marines continue." He made no effort to move closer to the rifles. Instead, he watched another layer of warm air roll gently across the valley as though waiting for something invisible to settle into place. Ethan found himself watching Nathan instead of the shooters. There was no tension in the elderly veteran's posture. No desire to win an argument. Only quiet observation. Carter noticed the same thing. "Have you made shots like this before?" he asked. Nathan smiled faintly. "Not exactly like this." Carter waited for more, but nothing followed. The answer revealed almost nothing while somehow suggesting far more than it said. Another unsuccessful attempt echoed across the range. Once again, the distant steel remained silent. Frustration spread through the firing line. One instructor rubbed his forehead, while another quietly recalculated environmental data for what felt like the 10th time that hour. The confidence that had filled the range earlier in the afternoon was slowly giving way to uncertainty. Ethan looked toward the old leather rifle case resting beside Nathan's worn canvas bag. It was carefully maintained despite decades of use. The brass buckles had faded, and the leather carried countless scratches, yet every strap remained perfectly repaired. Nothing about it looked decorative. Everything about it looked earned. As Nathan reached down to adjust the case, a small folded cleaning cloth slipped halfway from one of the side pockets. Its faded fabric carried stains that time had never completely removed. Nathan paused for only a second before gently tucking it back inside, but something changed in his eyes during that brief movement. They no longer reflected the bright California range. For the first time all afternoon, they seemed focused on a place that existed many years earlier. Ethan noticed the subtle shift immediately. It was not sadness. It was recognition. The old cloth clearly meant something far greater than a simple piece of equipment. Before Ethan could ask about it, a communications radio crackled behind the firing line. An instructor quietly confirmed that one final demonstration attempt would be authorized before the training session concluded. The challenge still stood. For 1,000 meters. One opportunity. Every Marine slowly turned toward Nathan again, and this time not a single person laughed. As the range settled into an uneasy silence, Nathan Walker rested one hand on the worn leather case beside him. His fingers brushed against the faded cleaning cloth tucked inside the side pocket, and for a brief moment the sounds of electronic wind meters, distant conversations, and clicking keyboards seemed to disappear beneath the steady rush of memory. Decades earlier, another valley had stretched before him beneath a different sun. The mountains had been greener then, the air heavier, and every gust carried the scent of wet earth instead of dry California dust. Nathan had been a young Marine Scout sniper standing beside his instructor, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Callahan, a man whose face rarely changed expression but whose eyes seemed capable of reading an entire landscape with one quiet glance. Nathan remembered spending hours watching through his scope, while Callahan never once looked through his own. The younger Marines often wondered why. Finally, Nathan had asked the question. The older Marine simply smiled and pointed toward a distant hillside. "Tell me what you see." Nathan described rocks, trees, shadows, and the direction of the breeze. Callahan slowly shook his head. "You are describing objects." "I asked what you see." Confused, Nathan looked again. Minutes passed before he finally noticed tiny leaves turning at different moments, birds changing direction before crossing an open clearing, and heat drifting upward from exposed stone while cooler air settled beneath the trees. Callahan nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Now you are beginning to see movement instead of scenery." That lesson continued for weeks. Every morning began without rifles. Instead, they studied valleys, ridgelines, clouds, streams, and sunlight. Nathan often wondered when they would finally practice shooting. Callahan always answered the same way. "The bullet is the easy part. Understanding where it must travel is the difficult part." One afternoon, they stood overlooking a broad valley while another team struggled to place accurate shots using the best calculations available at the time. Nathan remembered asking why every prediction seemed slightly wrong. Callahan knelt beside a patch of grass, scooped a handful of loose soil into his palm, and allowed the smallest grains to drift away. Then he quietly said words Nathan never forgot. "The wind tells stories. The ground tells the truth. Listen to the one that never changes." From that day forward, Nathan stopped chasing numbers alone. He learned to study how sunlight warmed stone differently than soil, how rising air bent gently around cliffs, and how shadows quietly reshaped invisible currents throughout the afternoon. Technology improved over the years, but nature never abandoned its own language. Standing once again on the Marine firing range decades later, Nathan slowly removed the faded cleaning cloth from the leather case and gently folded it between his hands. The edges had become soft with age, and one corner still carried a nearly invisible set of initials stitched by Callahan himself many years before. Ethan Brooks happened to glance toward the cloth just as Nathan carefully placed it back inside the pocket. "Was that from your service?" he asked quietly. Nathan looked down at the old fabric before answering with a faint smile. "It belonged to the Marine who taught me that patience can see farther than any scope." Ethan nodded without another question. Something about the way Nathan spoke made the cloth feel less like a keepsake and more like a lesson carried across an entire lifetime. Behind them, another set of firing data appeared on the ballistic monitors, but Nathan never looked at the screens. His eyes remained fixed on the valley, where sunlight continued sliding across the hills exactly as it had all afternoon, patiently revealing truths that no computer had yet learned to measure. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, stretching longer shadows across the valley as the training range settled into an unfamiliar quiet. Nobody seemed eager to prepare the next firing solution anymore. The conversations that had filled the range earlier had faded into scattered whispers, replaced by thoughtful glances toward the elderly veteran who still stood calmly beside his weathered rifle case. Nathan Walker neither sought attention nor avoided it. He simply continued studying the landscape with the same patient focus that had puzzled everyone since his arrival. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks could not shake the feeling that he had seen something important without fully understanding it. His eyes drifted once more toward the faded cleaning cloth resting inside Nathan's leather case. Then he noticed something else. Sewn into the inside flap of the old canvas range bag was a small embroidered patch, almost completely faded with age. Most of the stitching had worn away, but one line remained barely readable. It was not a unit name. It was not a rank. It was a simple call sign. Ethan quietly leaned closer until he could make out the final letters. His expression changed immediately. He had seen that call sign before, not in a history book or a museum display, but only a few months earlier during an advanced professional military education lecture discussing legendary Marine reconnaissance operations. The instructor had briefly mentioned an unidentified marksman whose observations had influenced generations of long-range fieldcraft. The name itself had never appeared on the presentation, only the mysterious call sign preserved in archival records. Ethan looked back toward Nathan with growing disbelief. It could not possibly be the same man. Yet the coincidence refused to leave his mind. Trying not to attract attention, Ethan stepped away from the firing line and walked toward the communications trailer near the edge of the range. Inside, a duty communications Marine looked up from a radio console. "Everything all right?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. "I need to verify a historical service record." The Marine raised an eyebrow. "Now?" Ethan nodded. "It may be important." Within minutes, a secure directory connected him with the base administrative office. Ethan quietly read the faded call sign before adding the name Nathan Walker. The civilian clerk on the other end typed for several seconds. Then the keyboard suddenly stopped. Silence filled the line. "Can you repeat that name?" the clerk finally asked. Ethan repeated it carefully. Another long pause followed before the clerk spoke again, this time with noticeably different tone. "Do not disconnect." The call transferred without explanation. A deeper voice answered almost immediately. "This is Colonel Richard Hayes." Ethan introduced himself and explained exactly what he had found. Once again, silence replaced conversation. Finally, the colonel asked only one question. "Is Mr. Walker still on the range?" Ethan glanced through the trailer window. Nathan had not moved. "Yes, sir." The colonel answered without hesitation. "Do not let him leave. I will notify General Michael Reynolds immediately." The line disconnected before Ethan could ask another question. His heart began beating faster. Outside, nothing appeared to have changed. Marines continued discussing wind charts while instructors reviewed equipment. Nathan remained quietly watching the distant hills beneath the golden afternoon light. Nobody around him realized that somewhere beyond the range, a single name had already begun moving through the chain of command with remarkable speed. Ethan stepped back into the sunlight and looked toward the elderly veteran with entirely different eyes. Whatever history Nathan Walker carried, it was important enough that a colonel had chosen not to ask for paperwork, photographs, or confirmation. He had asked only one thing: make sure the old Marine does not leave. Only a few minutes had passed since Ethan Brooks ended the phone call, yet the atmosphere across the firing range had begun to change in ways that no one could explain. Staff Sergeant Ryan Carter noticed it first. A military police vehicle quietly stopped near the entrance before pulling aside without activating lights or sirens. Moments later, another staff vehicle arrived. No one stepped out immediately. The Marines exchanged curious glances, assuming a routine inspection was about to begin. Nathan Walker seemed completely unaware of the growing attention. He remained standing near the firing line with both hands resting lightly on the handle of his weathered leather rifle case, while his eyes continued following the slow movement of sunlight across the distant ridges. He appeared more interested in the changing shadows than in the arriving vehicles. Ethan walked back toward him, trying to hide the growing anticipation inside his own voice. "Sir," he asked gently, "have you visited this base before?" Nathan smiled without taking his eyes from the valley. Long before most of these buildings existed. Ethan nodded quietly. He wanted to ask more questions, but something told him the answers would arrive soon enough. The low sound of another engine echoed from farther down the access road. This time, every head on the range turned. A dark command vehicle rolled toward the firing line at an unhurried pace before stopping several yards away. The driver stepped out first, followed by a Marine colonel in service uniform. Staff Sergeant Carter immediately called the range to attention. Every Marine straightened instinctively. The colonel acknowledged Carter with a brief nod, but did not ask for a range report. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the firing line until they settled on the elderly veteran standing quietly beside the old leather case. Without hesitation, the colonel walked directly toward Nathan. The surrounding Marines watched in complete silence. They expected introductions, paperwork, perhaps even questions about identification. None came. The colonel stopped in front of Nathan and offered a respectful handshake with both hands. "Mr. Walker," he said warmly, "thank you for waiting." Nathan accepted the handshake with the same quiet humility he had shown all afternoon. "I was told someone wished to speak with me." "Yes, sir," the colonel replied. "He is already on his way." Confused whispers spread among the Marines. Carter looked toward Ethan, whose expression quietly confirmed that he knew more than he could say. Nathan remained perfectly calm. "There is no need to inconvenience anyone because of me." The colonel smiled. "With respect, sir, that decision was not mine to make." Before anyone could ask another question, the distant sound of rotor blades drifted across the afternoon sky. Every Marine instinctively looked upward. A military helicopter appeared beyond the hills, circling once before descending toward a nearby landing area reserved for visiting senior leadership. Dust lifted gently across the edge of the range as the aircraft settled onto the ground. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the fading rotor blades and the soft breeze moving across the valley Nathan had been studying all day. A staff officer stepped quickly from the helicopter, followed by a tall Marine general whose calm expression carried neither urgency nor ceremony. He did not pause to greet the assembled officers first. He walked directly across the range with steady purpose, his eyes fixed on one man alone. The younger Marines watched in stunned silence as the distance between the general and the elderly veteran slowly disappeared. Nathan simply closed the old leather case, brushed a trace of dust from its surface, and waited with the quiet patience of someone who had never expected recognition, yet was never surprised when the truth finally caught up. The Marine general crossed the firing range with an unhurried confidence that immediately changed the atmosphere around everyone present. Boots that had been shifting nervously only moments earlier became perfectly still. Conversations disappeared. Even the instructors who had spent the entire afternoon focused on ballistic data now watched in complete silence. Staff Sergeant Ryan Carter stood at attention as the general passed without slowing his pace. The colonel followed several steps behind, saying nothing. Every Marine expected formal introductions, official questions, or at least a request for identification. Instead, the general stopped directly in front of Nathan Walker and held his gaze for several quiet seconds. Then, with deliberate respect, he raised his hand in a crisp Marine salute. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Nathan looked briefly surprised before returning the salute with the calm dignity of a man who had performed the gesture countless times throughout his life. The general lowered his hand and smiled warmly. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I have wanted to meet you for many years." Nathan gave a modest nod. "I am afraid you have the advantage, General. I do not believe we have met." The general chuckled softly. "No, sir. But every Marine sniper who came through advanced instruction during my generation studied field notes that began with your observations. Your reports were never written to impress anyone. They were written so the next Marine would come home wiser than the last. Several younger Marines exchanged stunned glances. Ethan Brooks felt the words settle more heavily than any speech he had ever heard. Nathan looked quietly toward the valley before answering. Those lessons belonged to the men who taught me. The general nodded with genuine respect. And you honored them by passing those lessons forward. He then turned toward Staff Sergeant Carter. Has anyone here completed the demonstration shot? Carter answered honestly. No, General. Every attempt has missed the target. The general looked back at Nathan. Would you be willing to help us understand what we are missing? Nathan hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. Only if the lesson matters more than the result. It does, the general replied without hesitation. That is exactly why I came. Carter immediately ordered a firing position prepared. A precision rifle already zeroed for the range was carefully placed on the mat. Spotters confirmed the target distance once more. Wind meters continued collecting fresh data while instructors entered updated conditions into the ballistic computers. Nathan slowly approached the firing position but never looked at the electronic displays. Instead, he removed his jacket, folded it neatly beside the rifle, and spent several quiet moments studying the valley exactly as he had done all afternoon. He watched the shadows sliding across the rocky slopes. He observed a hawk circling above a distant ridge before suddenly changing direction. He noticed a ribbon of dust lifting briefly near the center of the valley before disappearing again. The Marines watched every movement with complete attention. Nathan finally knelt behind the rifle but did not touch the trigger. He adjusted the bipod only slightly, then asked Ethan in a calm voice, "Would you hand me that small cloth from my case?" Ethan carefully retrieved the faded cleaning cloth and placed it beside him. Nathan gently rested one hand upon it for just a moment before settling behind the optic. Through the scope, he did not immediately search for the steel target. Instead, he quietly traced the invisible path between his position and the distant hillside, as though reading a familiar map drawn by sunlight, wind, and memory. Nearly a full minute passed before he finally whispered, almost to himself, "Now the valley is ready." The entire firing range stood perfectly still as Nathan Walker rested his cheek against the rifle stock. His breathing remained slow and almost impossible to notice. The advanced ballistic display beside him continued updating wind values every few seconds, but Nathan never looked at it. His attention remained fixed beyond the optic, beyond the steel target itself, following an invisible path only experience seemed able to reveal. The afternoon breeze softened. The heat rising from the valley floor shifted ever so slightly as the long shadows stretched farther across the hills. Nathan waited without the slightest trace of impatience. Nearly everyone watching expected him to fire immediately. Instead, he lowered his eye from the scope for a brief moment and looked toward the distant ridgeline with nothing but quiet concentration. General Michael Reynolds noticed the movement and smiled faintly. He understood exactly what the old Marine was doing. Nathan was not waiting for confidence. He was waiting for agreement between the land and the air. Another 10 silent seconds passed before Nathan settled behind the rifle once more. His finger rested calmly outside the trigger guard until one final gentle breeze crossed the firing line. The nearby range flags fluttered lightly, but Nathan never looked at them. His eyes remained on the shimmering valley. Then, almost too softly for anyone to notice, he whispered, "There you are." His finger moved with calm precision. The rifle discharged with a single sharp report that rolled across the open valley before fading into the surrounding hills. Nobody spoke. Every eye followed the invisible flight of the bullet. Time itself seemed to slow as the sound echoed farther and farther into the distance. Then, several long seconds later, a clear metallic ring floated back across the valley. It was unmistakable. The steel target had been struck cleanly. Complete silence settled over the range. No celebration erupted. No one cheered. Even the spotter lowered his binoculars without saying a word because no announcement was necessary. Every Marine had heard the impact for themselves. Ethan Brooks slowly exhaled, realizing he had unconsciously been holding his breath the entire time. Staff Sergeant Ryan Carter stared toward the distant target before quietly shaking his head in disbelief. The ballistic computer beside the firing position still displayed a firing solution that differed slightly from the one Nathan had trusted. The numbers had been close. The old Marine had been exact. "General." Reynolds stepped forward and extended his hand once again. Nathan accepted it with the same quiet humility he had shown throughout the afternoon. "Thank you," the general said sincerely. "Not for making the shot, for reminding us what the shot truly depended on." Nathan smiled gently before placing the faded cleaning cloth back into the old leather case. "Technology is a remarkable teacher," he replied, "but it still learns from people who were willing to watch before they measured." Staff Sergeant Carter removed his cover and approached Nathan respectfully. "Sir," he said, "I owe you an apology. I judged your age before I respected your experience." Nathan shook his hand warmly. "You judge what you could see. That is something every Marine eventually learns to overcome." One by one, the younger Marines stepped forward. Their expressions carried no embarrassment now, only genuine respect. Ethan looked once more at the worn leather case, the faded cloth, and the patient man who had carried both across an entire lifetime without asking anyone to recognize them. As the golden light settled across the California hills, Nathan quietly lifted the old case onto his shoulder and began walking toward the parking area without waiting for photographs, applause, or ceremony. Behind him, every Marine on the firing line instinctively stood a little straighter, not because anyone ordered them to, but because respect had finally replaced assumption. The valley remained silent once more, carrying away the echoes of a single shot while leaving behind a lesson that would outlast every computer on the range. Some legends never ask to be remembered. They simply leave others seeing the world more clearly than before.